Well, welcome to episode 371 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This was an episode which was originally supposed to be set in the Dominican Republic. In fact, an entire video was shot on location in the Dominican Republic, but unfortunately, while I might know a little bit of a thing or two about records, I know almost nothing about the sound quality that you get when you're on a beach and the surf is pounding just next door. Despite the valiant efforts of a regular viewer and friend of this channel who knows a lot more about AV than me, that version of the video was destined for the bin. So you're stuck with me here again in my comfy chair, although here to talk about a fabulous record, this one by Harold Land, which came out in 1960 on Jazzland Records, which is that kind of odd little sub-imprint of Riverside called West Coast Blues. I've got a first pressing, which somebody has repaired with a little bit of hockey tape or something down there, but no matter. Anyway, sounds just great, as all those old Jazzland early pressings do. So Harold Land is one of the most talented tenor saxophonists that America ever produced. And while he's not exactly underappreciated, because his records these days are pretty routinely praised, he never made it as big back in the day as he could have or maybe should have. And a lot of that is probably down to the fact that being a West Coaster, he had the opportunity to spend most of his career on the East Coast, but he elected not to. His playing kind of straddles the cool sounds of the West Coast with the more aggressive sounds of East Coast hard bop. And his whole career, in fact, really is a mixture of those two coasts. He makes his name originally with a classic East Coast combo, the Brown-Roach Quintet, but then goes back to California and really makes some tremendous records with one of the greatest combos that emerged in LA in the 1950s, the Curtis Counce group. All that great group work of the 1950s was followed by a stellar solo career as a leader in the 1960s. And in that decade, he also worked with people like Wes Montgomery, Thelonious Monk, Hampton Hawes, and the great bassist Red Mitchell. Heavily influenced by John Coltrane, his playing gets edgier and more hard-edged, more avant-garde after the mid-1960s. Then, heading into the late 60s and early 70s, he had this tremendous quintet with the vibes player Bobby Hutcherson. His style always moved with the times, but he was always melodic and he always swung. Harold Land was born in December 1928 in Houston, Texas. When he was 5 in 1933, his family moves to San Diego, and they lived at 1703 Imperial Avenue. This, I think, is a photograph of the house next door if theirs was torn down. Surprise, surprise, there's a freeway running through what was, of course, at one point an historically black neighborhood. He went to Memorial Junior High in San Diego and then San Diego High School. He starts off playing piano. That's what he plays initially in the school orchestra, but he switches to the tenor saxophone when he hears Coleman Hawkins play Body and Soul, which really rocks his world. When he graduates in 1946, his first serious gig is with a local trumpeter, Fro Brigham. Now, the Brigham Band was a pretty big deal in San Diego, if not much further, and they had a standing gig at the Creole Palace at the Douglas Hotel. Now, the Creole Palace was a real hub for black nightlife in San Diego and the surrounding area, and it was sometimes called the Cotton Club of the West. Other people who played there were people like Errol Garner, Sonny Criss, and Hampton Hawes. And it's with Fro Brigham and his bandmates that Harold Land, on April 25th, 1949, makes his first ever recordings for Savoy Records, actually, in Los Angeles, at sessions produced by Dick Bach, who, of course, would be the guy that went on to found Pacific Jazz Records. Of the 4 sides they recorded that day, only one was released at the time, and that's a track called San Diego Bounce, which has an interesting history. It was a modest hit in the San Diego area, but it was a huge hit in Jamaica, of all places, because it was bootlegged by Cox and Dodd. Now, Cox and Dodd, those of you who are reggae fans will know, was a big-time ska and reggae producer later on in Jamaica. But in those days, he was making his name with the sound system on the streets of Kingston, and he would just go and get contemporary American R&B tracks, because this is basically an R&B track, and rebrand them, reissue them as his own music, and with different titles. So this ended up getting released as Coxsone Shuffle, but of course it was a Harold Land record with Fro Brigham from San Diego. Big hit in Jamaica. 1949 is a big year for Harold Land in other ways because he also meets and marries his wife Lydia, and that's followed a year later, 1950, with the birth of their son. By the mid-50s, Harold Land knew that to make a serious living as a jazz musician, he was going to have to leave the small town scene of San Diego. So he moves just up the road to Los Angeles, leaving his family behind, and he lives for about a year in LA on, as he says, crackers and peanut butter, trying to make his mark in what was a very competitive LA jazz scene. However, Fortune was working in his favor. His friend Eric Dolphy, the brilliant sax and flute player, told him that the Brown-Roach Quintet, who were the new big thing on the bop/hard bop scene, needed a saxophonist because Teddy Edwards, who had been holding down that chair, was leaving because he didn't want to tour with the group. As it happens, Clifford Brown had already heard Land play at a club and had been impressed. Dolphy invites Land to come to a jam session at Dolphy's house. Brown is there, Roach is there, they're impressed, and Land is in the band. And on the strength of that, he was able to move his family north from San Diego to LA to join him. Land tours widely with Brown and Roach, ending up based in Philadelphia for much of that time, where he lived with Richie Powell, who was the piano player for the quintet, and also with Bud Powell, the famous piano player who was, of course, the brother of Richie. He stays for almost 2 years and appears on some classic LPs, including 1954's Brown and Roach Incorporated and 1955's Study in Brown. But late that year, his wife called from LA to say his grandmother was dying, and he decides to leave the Brown-Roach Quintet and head back to LA to be with his family. While it was brief, Land's time with the Brown-Roach Quintet resulted in some amazing music and really was his big break, not just because of his association with the two famous players who were the co-leaders, but also due to the quality of his playing, which, as I mentioned, neatly straddled the sounds of the West Coast and the East. He also, by his own account, felt musically happier in that group than at any point in his career, and to have spent that much time away from his young family, you'd think he would have had to have enjoyed it. Back in LA, he joins the Curtis Counce group, and he's with Curtis Counce for about 3 years or so. And if you don't know about the Curtis Counce group, find out, because finding out only leads to good things. They put out 3 great records for contemporary, 3.5, I guess, actually. And in this period, too, the late 50s, Land also makes great records with Victor Feldman, with Herb Geller, with Cal Tjader, and a bunch of other great local players. His next record as a leader is 1958's Herald in the Land of Jazz, which has since been retitled and reissued many times as Grooveyard. That record featured a number of his current or future bandmates in the Counce group, including the Swedish trumpeter Rolf Eriksson, piano player Carl Perkins, and the drummer Frank Butler. It also includes that tremendous first-call bassist from the West Coast, Leroy Vinegar. The Counce group is renowned as one of the closest knit and most dynamic combos to come out of LA during that whole period of time. But tragedy strikes them in March 1958 when their piano player Carl Perkins, and this is a guy, frankly, who is pretty close to being an equal to Horace Silver in terms of having a funky feel within hard bop, just a tremendous piano player, dies of an overdose at just 29. And sadly, for that version of the group, despite the 3.5 records they left us, it's basically a case of what might have been. They were all hit really hard by Perkins' death, and the group kind of unravels in the next few months. A reworked lineup, one which includes Land, gets together to make one more record towards the end of 1958, but then they split for good. Land does session work for about a year after that, and then he goes on to make arguably his 2 greatest records. The first of those is called The Fox, and it was made for a tiny little label called Hi-Fi Jazz in late 1959 in a quintet format with the somewhat ill-starred trumpeter Dupree Bolton and the piano player Elmo Hope. And then in the spring of 1960, he travels to San Francisco, where he makes this record. This record is made over 2 days in May 1960, the 17th and the 18th in San Francisco, and Wally Heider is the engineer. This being a Jazzland release, Orrin Keep News is listed as the producer, and I think he probably did actually make the trip from New York to San Francisco for the session for reasons I'll mention in a second. Harold Land is on tenor, and he's supported by a real all-star cast who, despite the title of the record, are pretty much all East Coasters. The great Wes Montgomery is on guitar, Joe Gordon's on trumpet, Barry Harris handles the piano, Sam Jones is on bass, and the rhythm section is completed by Louis Hayes on drums. One puzzle I encountered when putting this episode together was wondering how it was that all of these people, many of whom were in different groups, ended up in San Francisco all at the same time to make this record. Riverside didn't have super deep pockets, so it was unlikely they were going to fly people in from all over the country just to make a particular record. But in this case, it seems like they were doing kind of a batch operation in San Francisco over a period of about a month. Just a few days later, both Montgomery and Jones are on a record by Cannonball Adderley, which is also recorded in San Francisco, called Cannonball Adderley and the Pole Winners. Sam Jones was not on that record, but he was part of Montgomery's group, so I'm guessing that was timed to coincide with a tour that Montgomery was doing. As for Harold Land and Joe Gordon, they'd actually arrived in San Francisco earlier at the end of the previous month in April because they were supporting Thelonious Monk in his stand at the Blackhawk, and they are the +2 in that great record, Thelonious Monk Quartet Plus Two at the Blackhawk in San Francisco. Side one starts with Ursula, which is a Harold Land composition, and it really puts me in the mind of 1950s LA detective noir. Land has a similarly languid, mellow tone to Stan Getz at points, like Getz never plays a harsh note, but as I mentioned, he's a busier player, being halfway between the extremes of cool and hard bop. The next track is Charlie Parker's Klacktavidsystine, and being a Parker tune, it's played at the appropriate velocity. There are a couple of highlights here. Wes Montgomery's beautifully fluid playing, and then there's this bit at the end where Hayes is trading fours with both Harold Land and Joe Gordon, which is terrific. The last track on side one is Don't Explain. Now, this is a real showpiece for Land. At this point on the record, he's really shown you his whole range, but in tempo and mood, this is really his sweet spot. Side two begins with the title track, West Coast Blues, very aptly titled because it could have come as a track off of pretty much any Contemporary Records LP from the latter part of the 1950s. It's got a slower tempo, but it swings hard, total mood enhancer. Terrain is by Harold Land. This one is a little more up-tempo. It's a really propulsive track, and it contains some of Joe Gordon's most inspired playing on the whole LP. And the very last track is Compulsion, another Harold Land composition, fast-paced affair where 16th notes are the basic unit of exchange. This record offers tremendous variety, almost everything in Harold Land's toolkit at this stage in his career. Somewhat perplexingly, it often tops lists of best cool jazz records. If you were to conduct an internet search with that phrase, this record is almost certain to come up. And while there are some moments on here which perhaps justify that, it's way more than simply a cool jazz record. The presence of Montgomery and Joe Gordon means it's got a fabulous front line. They cover all kinds of different styles, all with aplomb. It captures Harold Land at the early peak, I would argue, of his career, and it's a great jumping off point to the rest of his music. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.